Our next guest for the day is David Sanger. It's my pleasure to introduce him. David E. Sanger is National Security Correspondent and Senior Writer with the New York Times. He has served as Tokyo Bureau Chief, Washington Economic Correspondent, White House Correspondent, and Chief Washington Correspondent. In a 36-year reporting career for the paper, he has been on 3 teams that have won Pulitzer Prizes, most recently in 2017. He has also been awarded the Weintraub Prize, the Aldo Beckman Prize, and in 2 separate years, the Merriman Smith Memorial Award for coverage of national security issues. Many of you are likely familiar with his work, both in cybersecurity and his earlier work with reporting on nuclear proliferation and other security-related and foreign policy-related matters. I am currently reading the book he's probably going to talk about, The Perfect Weapon: War, Sabotage, and Fear in the Cyber Age. His copiously documented research provides undeniably serious context for our work in the election integrity space. I was pretty taken aback with all the details in there and what it revealed. Mr. Sanger is a 1982 graduate of Harvard College, and at the Kennedy School of Government, he co-teaches with Graham T. Allison Jr., Central Challenges in American National Security, Strategy, and the Press. Please join me in welcoming David Sanger.
Well, thank you very much. It's great to be here and great to see many people who've helped along with stories I've had been working on and educating me in the past, and certainly in my work on the book. Particularly thanks to my friend and classmate Lynn Garland, who asked me to come out here today. Lynn is a champion organizer and thinker about all things, so it's great to be back here with her as well. What I thought I would do today, having listened to Senator Wyden, who was focused in on the legislation that he's getting ready to introduce, or reintroduce, I should say, is come to you first with some sort of broader conclusions about how election issues fit into the moment that we are in the world of cyber conflict, which is something that I lay out at length in The Perfect Weapon, which came out in June of last year, and you'll see anew in a month or two in a paperback version that has an update that takes us through this past year, including some of the lessons of the 2018 election and a lot on Huawei and the 5G issues that have come up in recent times. And then what I wanted to do was then narrow down a little bit about how this applies to the area where you are where you have been examining this. I'm no expert on the specifics of how one secures voting machines. From that, I've learned from a lot of you in the room, Alex Haldeman and others who have been kind enough to help me and my Times colleagues on this. But it's important to remember that what you're dealing with is not isolated to the election issues. There are broader issues of how we're managing cyber conflict, and I deliberately don't use the phrase cyber war, but instead the cyber conflicts we have seen so far. We start, of course, down in the basement of the DNC, not too far from here. It's up on Capitol Hill. We took this photo in December of 2016. Those of you in the room old enough to recall it and may remember the symbolism of that strapped together 4-drawer file cabinet there with the broken off handle on the bottom. That is, of course, one of the file cabinets that the Watergate burglars broke into in 1972. It's actually the DNC's last remnant of the Watergate attack. And you'll remember that the thieves got caught because they broke into the Watergate, taped open the door, and a security guard came by and noticed the door was taped open and called the cops and arrested these guys. You'll also remember that we have basically no memory of what was in those four file cabinet drawers. First, because they weren't widely broadcast and made public, and second, because the contents were incredibly boring when you go back through them. To the right of that, wrapped in plastic, you see something that looks like an oversized laptop computer. That is the server of the Democratic National Committee in 2016. That is what the Russians broke into. Okay? Periodically, if you're following the president's Twitter feed, he says, "What about the server? How come no one's seen the server?" Well, if you want it, it's right there. That's remarkable for a couple of reasons. First of all, obviously, no one had to get arrested. They did later on get indicted because they never had to enter the United States. They never had to tape open a door. They got far more data out of that, obviously, than anything you could have fit into four file drawers in 1972. And we remember a good deal of what it was because it was all made public. And this was, of course, the first step toward the next phase of the attack, which you all are focused in on, which is, of course, the entry into the registration systems, which I will come back to. I mention all of this because, you know, when we talk about data in the cloud and so forth, it all seems quite ethereal, but it's in a place, and that server, of course, is the place. And we recounted all of this in a lengthy story in December of 2017 that was the lead entry in that 2016 that was the lead entry in that 2017 Pulitzer that you just heard about for a team of Times reporters. But our work on it has continued, and 3 chapters of the book actually walk you through the detailed timeline of what happened, what decisions were being made inside the White House about how to respond to all of this, which I'll discuss in just a moment. So then the question is, what makes cyber different? What's changed since that Watergate break-in? Well, cyber is the perfect weapon because it is dirt cheap, it's deniable, it's hard to trace, and because you can adjust a cyber attack up and down to suit your needs. And that's absolutely critical. Absolutely critical. You hear a lot of comparisons between cyber weapons and nuclear weapons. Most of them do not work. But the one that really doesn't work is that while you can adjust the yield on a nuclear weapon, by and large, it's an on-off switch. If a nuclear weapon goes off, you're not going to be able to hide it, and you're probably not going to be able to hide where it originated from. With a cyber weapon, it's more like running on a thermostat. You can target it very narrowly. You can target it much more broadly. You can dial it up. You can dial it down. And most importantly, you can make sure that it is calibrated not to bring about a military response, which is what has happened with every major cyber attack that you have read about in the past 4 or 5 years. You've noticed that we've been in debates about do we respond or not respond. If we do respond, do we do sanctions? Do we do criminal prosecutions? What it is. You've never seen a cyber attack where the president seriously considered taking military action in response, even when messing with the election system. So what that tells you is that our opponents have figured out that if you don't want to take the United States on directly and militarily, which no country wants to do these days, whether it's the North Koreans, the Iranians, the Russians, the Chinese, you use cyber as your primary means of expressing power and influence, because it's the short of war way to go about doing this. It's also a ubiquitous problem now because of the spread of networks around the world. And it's one that we're not going to solve with technology alone. There was a moment in the nuclear age, there's been a moment with every other weapon where we thought, how can we go counter this? In nuclear, we obviously put together interceptors and anti-ballistic missile systems that would try to go intercept weapons. useful maybe half the time. We've never tested it in against real nuclear weapons, I'm glad to say. But we also recognized pretty quickly that we were going to need political solutions that went along with the technological solutions. And that's what's held together the peace for the past 70 years, right? A combination of technology, whether it is the primary launch systems or what my colleagues and I have written about at length, left of launch, the effort to go get into the software or guidance systems of missiles, as the U.S. did against North Korea a few years ago, when they were dropping their missiles into the water pretty frequently, and some kind of political solutions, which were the arms control treaties that we reached with the Soviet Union and then later with Russia, which are unfortunately now beginning to fray. It's also something that, like climate change, is something that we're going to have to learn how to manage. Cyber attacks are not going away. As long as these networks become the lifeblood of our society, they are going to be the attack space on the society. So it's not like this problem is just going to disappear because we've come up with the magic technological bullet. And the threat differs from each country. Rob Joyce, who used to run the TAO, the Tailored Access Operations Unit of the NSA, that's the American group that breaks into foreign computer systems, and then later went on to be the White House cyber coordinator until John Bolton eliminated the job, probably concluding that we were over-coordinated within the U.S. government on cyber issues. I heard him last week make a great comparison that Russia's like a hurricane, comes in on the big attacks, like the ones that so focused all of your attention 2 years ago, and then again in the midterms. China's like climate science. It's gradually moving to go try to change the environment in which we're operating. And that's something that we need to go remember. Now, to the big question I get asked the most often, which is, are we in a cyber war? The answer is no. We've only seen cyber conflict so far. We have not seen strategic effects. We've seen tactical moves, right? Believe me, if you're in a full cyber war, you'll know it, because the lights won't be on and the communication systems won't work and so forth. What you've seen is skirmishing. That moment may come. And I would argue that we have seen similar moments in history before, but as I suggested, not in the nuclear age. I actually think the better comparison is to the invention of the airplane. This photo is from College Park, Maryland. For those of you who've been up to University of Maryland there, which is probably just about everybody in this room, this is part of what is now the soccer field up there. The Wright brothers brought the military flyer up there in 1908 and 1909, and they brought it up there because they were broke, and they needed to find a way to go sell their invention to the Army. So when they did, they first actually flew around right down near here, near the Potomac. They had the first crash of an airplane there that cost a human life. Was a military officer who was up trying to go figure this out. They had people walking across the bridges across the Potomac with picnic baskets to go watch this being flown around for the first time. And they realized they better get out of town and move this up to College Park when President Taft came out of the White House at one point and suggested that he really would like a ride on this thing. And they began thinking about the aerodynamic challenge involved and decided it would be better to get up to College Park. So they did. And when you read the histories of this, it's really remarkable because the generals who first looked at it said, what an incredible tool this is for us, because we can fly over enemy lines, survey where their vulnerable areas are. The pilot will come back and tell us about it. And when the pilot comes back, we'll then send the cavalry in. No one ever actually thought about arming the damn thing, which is, of course, like the early days of cyber. We had open letters. We had intercepted telephone calls. We had intercepted telegraph messages. So we initially thought about this as a weapon that would be used chiefly in surveillance. That didn't last long in the air world. Less than 10 years, we went to this. Of course, we had dogfights with the Germans. Again, no strategic effects, just sort of minor clashes at that time. By the late 30s, the Japanese had deployed this as a weapon in mass. Those are zeros. My dad is 95 years old, and he was the fighter director on a ship in the Pacific during Okinawa and Iwo Jima and so forth, and he always tells me that these things sounded like lawnmowers on their way in. We then moved to this, which is, of course, the Enola Gay, and ultimately the airplane technology got merged with a technology that nobody could have imagined in 1909, and we got this. Right now in the cyber world, we're kind of at the end of World War I. We've had these skirmishes. We understand the delivery vehicle. We don't understand very much about what kind of weapon itself is going to be delivered in the future through it. It might be as terrible as this. It might not be. But we have to have the humility to understand that we can't project out 25 or 30 years on this any better than the Wright brothers could have imagined that what they were showing in College Park would facilitate this kind of attack just a few decades later. So, how quickly did this come upon us? If you go to the worldwide threat assessment that's given to Congress each year, you may remember there was one given in January, at the end of January, that President Trump objected to because the intelligence agencies came to opposite conclusions than he had on small issues like Iran, North Korea, and ISIS. But you go to the 2000 threat assessment, no surprise, starts off with terrorism remains a preeminent threat to the homeland. If you go to read the cyber section of that, it won't take a whole lot of your day. The word cyber does not appear in the 2007 threat assessment. It's a dozen years ago. It wasn't because they weren't thinking about it. John Negroponte put this together. He was the first director of national intelligence. He's a neighbor of mine. I've talked to him at great length about it. They were aware, but they hadn't thought about how it is that you explain this to the public, a problem that we're still struggling with some today. A few weeks after that threat assessment came out, Steve Jobs came out and showed the first iPhone. And that changed everything because suddenly people began to understand that the target was not just a central system, it was what you were walking around with in your pocket. And that if they could get into that, you would happily walk it into your work networks or the Pentagon or the CIA or wherever. And of course, these systems, like early election machines, were not really built with security in mind. It wasn't until just a few years ago that Apple moved to encrypting your data routinely and having it in a system where they didn't have the keys for it. So that's not what happened with the iPhone 1. If you're looking for one of these, by the way, go to the back right corner of your nightstand. You probably tucked one away there about 10 years ago and haven't turned it on since. But if you find it, it feels like a brick when you pick it up these days. So of course, for the past 5 years, cyber has been ranked on those same worldwide threat assessments as the #1 threat facing the United States. You see the kind of wording that was used 2 years ago. There was similar wording this year. And we're beginning to move away, thank goodness, from that awful concept of a cyber Pearl Harbor, which was really only created by, among others, Leon Panetta, to scare Congress into action. It failed. By imagining an attack that was so big that it turned all of the power off from Boston to Washington or Seattle to LA. What we now recognize, as General Clapper has indicated, that what we've got is a much more subtle threat. Not that giant turnoff of power, which would result in a military response, but instead the fear of much more subtle data manipulation, which, of course, is what all of you are focused on. And for that, the main concerns are, of course, Russia, China, to a lesser degree, Iran and North Korea. And we still don't have a working concept of deterrence here, which is why you're all working on locking down the systems that you are. If you had an effective deterrent system, the urgency wouldn't be quite as great as it is in this room today. Now, on the surveillance side of this, we're not going to spend any time on it. The utility of doing surveillance is obvious. The left is the F-35. The right is the Chinese version of it. If they look similar, it's because the Chinese got into Lockheed Martin computer systems about 12 years ago, built this. It's about a third of the production price is the F-35, which is the most expensive airplane all of you in the room have ever paid for. Congratulations. I guess one solution could be we could order ours from the Chinese, but I have a funny feeling that that's not going to be considered to be a viable option. Okay. You're more focused on data manipulation. And the big event, the sort of, if there is a birthing event in cyber attacks for data manipulation, it's not actually in voting machines, it's in this room. This is the centrifuge hall in Natanz in Iran. That's Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, the former president of Iran, taking a tour of the centrifuges. We have a lot of data scientists in here, probably a smaller number, but a couple of folks who have dealt with nuclear. I won't turn this into a physics lesson, but all you need to know is that those big silvery devices you're looking at are centrifuges. They spin at supersonic speeds with a core in the middle. You feed uranium in. The heavier elements drop to the bottom, the lighter go to the top, and as you purify the uranium, if you get to 4% purification, you've got the fuel for nuclear power plants, and if you just keep spinning and you get to 90%, you have the fuel for a nuclear weapon, which is why countries build these and say, we're doing just what everybody else is doing. We're producing uranium for our nuclear power plants. In the Iranian case, we didn't believe them. And the United States launched the most sophisticated cyber weapon that has ever been seen in the world, much more sophisticated than anything the Russians have thrown at us in 2016 or beyond. It became popularly known as Stuxnet. The code name for the operation was Olympic Games. And, of course, that was the effort to speed up and slow down these centrifuges by getting into the computer systems that controlled them at Natanz. Not easy, because like election machines, they were walled off from the internet. There was an air gap. The Iranians thought, as many companies think, that an air gap is a solution. Of course, an air gap is only as good, a good solution if you could eliminate the idiots who walk across with a USB, or a very sophisticated method that the CIA and others developed that we learned from the Snowden documents about how you get into the computer system using a low-frequency radio wave from 7 or 8 miles away. You have to have implanted something first, of course, in the computer system, which they also were doing. These systems were all, that the Iranians used, were all made by Siemens. And, of course, the Iranians would periodically call the Siemens repairmen to come over and work on the SCADA system, the computing system that basically ran these centrifuges. And what do you know? We managed to get into 1,000 of these and blow them up, turning them into giant hand grenades that basically wiped out the hall. And that was, of course, the seminal event in cyber operations. It also became one of the biggest stories that we've published in this area in 2012. This was the core of a previous book I did called Confront and Conceal. You'll read more about what happened after it, including a 4-year-long FBI leak investigation, which I can tell you is a real pleasure to go through, that emerged from all of that. Now, Olympic Games raised all kinds of interesting questions. First, was it worth doing an attack on a country if you were only going to interrupt their program? What did we learn from the fact that it became publicly known because the code got out around the world. It wasn't like the New York Times or any other newspaper discovered the code. It escaped one day. It's a fascinating story how. Wasn't intended to from the Natanz laboratory. It happened because an Iranian scientist had gone in to work on the machines and the computing system and plugged into it with his laptop. The Stuxnet code got onto his laptop. He then went home. He plugged his same laptop into the internet. The code thought that it was still inside Natanz, and suddenly we saw hundreds of thousands of copies of it replicating around the world, which is how we got the source code, and without that, we never would have actually been able to break the story. It then took 14 months to find the story of how two presidents were deeply involved in this, Bush and Obama. President Bush handed it off, of course, to President Obama. And in the end, as he was reauthorizing the program, President Obama asked a really central question in the Situation Room one day of his aides. It's highly classified meetings about Olympic Games. And he said, think about every country that wants to attack the United States or is already attacking the United States and would love a justification to go do it. What will they think, what will they say when they learn what we did? Because he knew sooner or later it was going to get out. I don't think he thought it was going to get out as quickly as it did, but he knew it would get out. And the answer to that, of course, was pretty obvious, that they would all use this as a justification for using cyber against us, even if they were planning to do so anyway and didn't really need a justification. And of course, that's exactly what happened. The Iranians went after Saudi Aramco, wiped out 30,000 computers in one hit. The North Koreans did an operation against South Korea called Dark Soul against financial institutions and the media. The Russians, most importantly, long before they did the hacks here, went after the State Department, the White House, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and were never called out by the Obama administration because they considered this to be fairly standard surveillance kind of stuff. The Iranians went after the Sands Casino. Can't you really know how to hurt a country, right? I mean, God, to go after, it's one thing to go after election machines, but casinos? I mean, that's like the core of America. So the casino, of course, was owned by Sheldon Adelson, who had suggested one day in a talk at Yeshiva University that if you really wanted to teach the Iranians a lesson, you would just drop a nuclear weapon in the desert and tell them Tehran was next if they didn't give up their program. The Iranians thought, Sheldon Adelson, desert, Sands Casino. Be a shame if those guys walked in one day and turned the casino on and discovered it couldn't turn on. And of course, they walked in and their hard drives had been wiped. Similar thing happened with a German steel mill the Russians got to. And of course, the Sony case, the Office of Personnel Management, Marriott, which was all part of a giant big data collection operation by the Chinese. I mentioned Sony briefly. I'll just do it here briefly because I don't want to take your time with it. This was the great poster for an absolutely terrible movie called The Interview. But you may remember that this was another big data manipulation case and data destruction case where the plot of this movie is that Seth Rogen and James Franco play two reporters who are sent in to go interview Kim Jong-un. The CIA recruits them to assassinate him. This was before our president fell in love with Kim Jong-un. It was a crazy idea for a plot. The North Koreans heard about the movie before it was going to get released. They did the only reasonable thing you would do if you wanted to stop a movie from coming out. They wrote a letter to the Secretary General of the United Nations asking him to kill it, because we all know how deeply influential the Secretary General is among the Hollywood studios. When this got the predictable non-response, they sent this guy and his team to China, Malaysia, Thailand. They broke into the Sony systems, which were wide open. They spent 3 months lurking in the system, figuring out how everything that Sony did in their computer systems was linked to their accounting, their email, their production of movies, their communications. U.S. intelligence had no idea this was going on, just as we didn't see much happening in the election hack. This is Jim Clapper showing up in North Korea while the Sony hack was underway, but didn't know about it. He was trying to get the release of an American. The guy you see him talking to there is the same guy who runs the Reconnaissance General Bureau, the sort of North Korean CIA. He's the same guy who showed up in the Oval Office last year with that giant white envelope to invite the president to the summit in Singapore. It looked like the president had just won the Publishers Clearinghouse sweepstakes. And of course, a few weeks later, if you went into Sony, this is what you saw on your screen. It was completely a diversion. You had to reach back beneath your computer to unplug it if you were going to save your data from being wiped. Most people didn't. 2.5 minutes, they lost 70% of their computing power for Sony Pictures Entertainment. Then somebody had to go to the president and explain what this was. Was this an act of war? Was this an act of sabotage? Was it just what President Obama later called an act of digital vandalism? So he had to get briefed. This was not the briefers. That was a scene from the movie. I did find the briefers. One of them said, "I never thought I'd be here briefing on a bad Seth Rogen movie, sir." And Obama said, "How do you know it was a bad movie?" And said, "Sir, it's a Seth Rogen movie." Now, in the end, after much debate in the Situation Room about how to go respond, Obama comes out and tells all of us in the press room on his way to Hawaii one day, we cannot have a society in which some dictator someplace can start imposing censorship here in the United States. It was interesting. He went to the constitutional issue, being a constitutional lawyer, rather than to the question of data manipulation or attacking a corporation or whatever. And in the end, we imposed some mild sanctions on the North Koreans that they probably never felt amid every other sanction that we've imposed on the North Koreans. And that raised the question, was this digital vandalism? Was it something else? All questions that then became critical come the 2016 election. And of course, as you can see from this exchange between Paul Nakasone, the new head of the NSA and the U.S. Cyber Command, and Dan Sullivan, the senator from Alaska, a sort of understanding that we went through this entire period of history with no real deterrent set in. And a problem that's getting vastly worse. Some of you specialize in the Internet of Things. The last bar, second to the right, shows you about where we were at the end of last year with about 14 billion Internet of Things devices. All attack surfaces, of course. At the end of 2020, the year that you were all focused on because of the election, will be up slightly above 20 billion Internet of Things devices of varying degrees of protection. So that then takes us back to your issues. Remember the timeline here, that in 2015, it was the SVR, one of the KGB offshoots, that first attacked the DNC and was just there doing surveillance. The FBI detected it, or actually one of our allies detected it. They called the DNC, and like all of you, when you called in with a computer problem, they got connected to the help desk. And they discovered that the help desk was of no help. It turned out that the DNC didn't have a cybersecurity division. In fact, they had been given an extensive cybersecurity sort of audit before the election. They said, given a long list of things to do, they said, this is great, but we can't afford any of this. We're heading into an election. We'll do it after the election. Terrific. The DNC employee who ultimately spoke to the FBI special investigator didn't believe he was a special agent of the FBI. They spent months exchanging phone calls. And in the interim, John Podesta's emails, of course, disappeared. Many others were attacked. And then the GRU, a different Russian intelligence agency, the one linked most to the Russian military, came in and did the attack that took the material that ultimately got made public. Just to show you that the Russian government operates like our government, we don't believe that the SVR and the GRU each knew that the other one was in the system. All of this became public in 2016 in June, not because the U.S. government noticed it, but because finally the DNC woke up out of their slumber, called in CrowdStrike. CrowdStrike made the whole thing public, forced the hand of the U.S. intelligence agencies. By early August, we had reported in the Times that the CIA and other intelligence agencies had come to near certainty that this was ordered at the highest levels of the Kremlin. The U.S. government said nothing until October. Now, during that time that we were doing that reporting that summer, people were coming to President Obama with all kinds of ideas about how he might respond to this attack on the DNC. These were three of the ideas: reveal Putin's connections to the oligarchs, reveal his bank accounts in which he had billions, block Russian access to international transfers through the SWIFT system. Obama did not want to act. And the reason he didn't want to act was perfectly reasonable. He didn't want to appear to be meddling in the election, and he was afraid that Putin could come back on election day and attack the election machines, where all of you come into this. They didn't know how vulnerable the election machines might be. So they secretly sent off an order for a quick national intelligence estimate from the National Intelligence Council on the vulnerability of the election system. And they were actually happy when the results came back to discover that that system is so disparate, so discombobulated, so old in many cases, that they actually thought that it was a difficult thing for the Russians to hack in a systematic way. And they were right in that you couldn't do what you could do in Europe, where you might be able to get in, design one piece of software that would get you into basically an entire nation's voting system. But that obviously ran by many of the vulnerabilities that you'll be discussing today. In the end, they had to decide how to warn Putin. Obama met Putin in China, confronted him. Putin denied all of this. And just around this time, we were getting those reports from Arizona and Illinois, and we now know more than 20 other countries about the attacks on the voter registration system. The theory in the government was, don't worry about this, Hillary's going to win, so we'll deal with the Russians after the election, and we'll sanction them, and she'll carry that on. Now, I've read that isn't how things turned out. And of course, we ended up with a president who denied that all of this was going on, so he could not give that speech right after he was inaugurated, saying, my fellow Americans, I believe I was legitimately elected. I have no doubt about that, but we could never allow something like this to happen again and start the commission that would go, implement certain things by 2018 and certain things by 2020 and so forth. Instead, we had a president who came to the determination that this must not have happened, because if it did, it would affect his legitimacy. That mindset stuck through the summer of 2017 when he first met Vladimir Putin. And of course, he was forced to raise the election issues because the investigation was fully underway. Mueller had been appointed and so forth. So he meets Putin for the first time. They have some private conversations. They have conversations in larger settings. We're all in Hamburg at the G20. The meeting breaks up. It's the last meeting that the president has. He gets to Air Force One. They're getting ready to roll down the runway. I'm checking out of my hotel, a little hotel in Hamburg, because all the leaders had taken the nice hotels, right? I'm trying to read my hotel bill in German, and my cell phone rings. And it's Trump. Not for the first time and not for the last, but he was calling to make the argument to me that Putin had said to him that the Russians were so good at cyber that had they actually done this, they never would have been caught. Okay, so he was fully in denial phase. This comes out of the Inspector General's report just a few weeks ago about where we are today in attacking these issues. This was their breakdown of the different spots in the electoral process that could have vulnerabilities. And of course, it came to the conclusion that DHS, while headed in the right direction, has moved far too slowly and with far too few funds. In Pennsylvania, there was a separate commission and study that came to the conclusion that the bulk of Pennsylvania's voting machines are vulnerable to hacking and manipulation, as has been demonstrated by all of you. The vulnerability stems from many counties' use of insecure electronic voting systems that are susceptible to manipulation and offer no paper record, and therefore no way of verifying tabulation of votes when the veracity of the election results is questioned. They did in there say that they were somewhat agnostic about whether these would be hand-marked ballots or machine-marked ballots, something you'll be debating. You heard Senator Wyden on this issue, but basically came out in the rough direction that I think you heard from the senator. The report from DHS suggests they need a fair bit of work as well. And then none of this got, of course, to the next element of what the Russians were doing, which was the social media side. I won't dwell on that here. It's not central to what you're doing. But just a reminder to you, these all come from the Senate Investigative Committee, that while the attacks on the registration system were going on, we were seeing the Internet Research Agency, which was indicted along with the GRU for the hacking and the registration stuff, the Internet Research Agency for this kind of work, with just these ads that got at divisive issues in the U.S. This was one on Black Lives Matter. This was one of their less subtle ones. You got to wonder, people are actually getting paid to make this stuff up? Lynn will tell you a lot of my family comes from Texas, so I like this one here, which was an effort at Texas to promote Texas secession. I have a couple of relatives who I suspect would sign up to this. So what are we supposed to remember out of all of this? First, that we have political versus technological solutions here, and they're going to have to work in concert. Now in 2020, we will focus on the dangers of things like having digital transmission systems sitting on the actual election machines, which introduce another point of vulnerability. There's no particular reason, to my mind, other than speed of counting to go do that. And I hope that we look at what the Russians did in Ukraine, where they got into not the voting machines, but the reporting system that reported the tabulated results in the last election. They have another one coming up at the end of this month. That was absolutely critical. If you go listen to Russian newscasts that night, they had a different winner than the winner that was announced in Ukraine. Again, a way of sort of getting in, not at the machines, but at the reporting. The good news is that the Russians can't run the same playbook that they ran in 2016, right? Because we see that coming. Sony and others are ready for that. You even saw the difference in France when they ran their election, and I've learned a lot of lessons from what happened to us. So particularly on the social media side, just the awareness that this is coming and the ability to sort of identify something as a likely false or inauthentic ad makes a big difference. If we have to get to 2020 and have an event so big that it prompts the executive branch and the legislative branch to all go take action, that means you've had something that proves you didn't learn any lessons from 2016, right? And I would hope we wouldn't get to that. One of the reasons that many people in the cybersecurity world were kind of secretly hoping for a moderate version of a cyber Pearl Harbor, a turning off of the power, was the same thing you're getting at, that it would be the only way to sort of get the critter's attention, right? In an odd way, Doing that with an election, I think, would probably be the worst way of going about it. At least, a power outage you can probably recover from faster than you can recover in an odd way from an election where you're trying to sort out the true vote.
Thanks a lot, Mr.
Thank you.
Sanger. And